Every Thursday for 2 years, my wife told me she was having dinner with Sarah. I only found out by accident that Sarah had packed up and left Boise 26 months earlier, moving to Denver for a graduate program neither of us had ever discussed at our own dinner table. My name is Ethan. I'm 36 years old, and I teach shop class at Timberline High School, the kind of job where you spend your days trusting the material in front of you, because a 2x4 doesn't lie to you the way people sometimes do. You measure twice, you cut once, and the wood tells you the truth about itself every single time. I'd been married to Claire for 7 years by then, and for most of those years, I extended her the same kind of trust one gave a piece of clear pine, no knots, no hidden grain, nothing underneath the surface I needed to go looking for. We had a son, Jack, 5 years old, front tooth missing, the kind of kid who narrated his own life out loud whether you were listening or not. He believed his father could fix anything with the right socket wrench, and until that particular Tuesday night in October, I believed something almost as simple about my marriage, that whatever Claire told me was, by default, true. I'd built 7 years on that assumption without ever once testing it, the way you might build a deck on a foundation you never bothered to inspect because the house had never given you a reason to look underneath it. I found out about Sarah at a school fundraiser, of all the mundane places a marriage can start coming apart. It was a silent auction in the Timberline Gymnasium, folding tables draped in cheap gold cloth, the smell of burnt coffee and floor wax hanging in the air, kids' art projects taped to a corkboard behind the raffle table. I was standing near the punch bowl with a woman named Priya, whose daughter was in my 4th period class, making the kind of small talk parents make at these things, whether homework loads, whether the new gym floor had actually fixed the squeak by the free throw line. Somewhere in that conversation, completely without weight, without any sense that she was about to hand me something that would take my whole life apart, Priya mentioned she'd run into an old coworker of hers at a wedding out in Denver that spring. Actually, she said, laughing a little, it was so funny, it was the Sarah who used to live over on Bannock Street. You remember her? Moved out there, 2 years ago now. She looked happy. Married the guy she met out there, I think. I said something like, small world, and smiled the way you smile at a stranger's story that doesn't concern you, and took a sip of punch that had gone warm in the plastic cup. It took me 11 full seconds to understand what I'd just heard. I've counted them since, more times than I'd like to admit, replaying that gymnasium in my head like a scene I could somehow re-enter and handle differently. 11 seconds standing next to a folding table of donated gift baskets before the sentence finally finished assembling itself in my mind, the Sarah who used to live on Bannock Street, the Sarah who'd moved to Denver 2 years ago, married now, building a whole separate life 1,100 miles away, that was the same Sarah my wife had been having dinner with every single Thursday night for the past 2 years. That morning, buttering Jack's toast, Claire had said it exactly the way she always said it, light and unremarkable, a fact of the household as fixed as the weather, Mommy's having dinner with Sarah again tonight, bug. You be good for Daddy. She'd said some version of that sentence to our son, I would later calculate, somewhere close to 90 times across those 2 years. 90 Thursdays. 90 dinners with a woman who, according to the person standing 4 feet away from me holding a plate of store-bought cookies, had been living in another state, married to another man, building an entire life that had nothing to do with our Thursday nights at all. I didn't say anything to Priya. I want to be honest about that, because it's the first of several moments in this story where I had a clear, obvious next step in front of me and I didn't take it. I smiled, said something about needing to go find Jack's teacher to talk about a field trip form, and walked away with my heart doing something strange and cold in my chest, a hum underneath my ribs that I couldn't name yet because I hadn't let myself finish the thought that was building toward it. I drove home that night with both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the way you drive when you're not fully trusting your own reflexes. Boise slid by outside the windows, the foothills going purple dark against a clear October sky, the strip malls along Fairview lit up in their usual orange and white glow, a city I'd lived in my whole life suddenly looking, for the length of that drive, like a place I didn't fully recognize anymore. Claire was already home when I got there, in the kitchen, doing the thing she always did after her own version of a normal Tuesday, unloading the dishwasher, humming something under her breath, Jack's homework folder open on the counter next to a juice box with a bent straw. She looked up when I came in and asked how the fundraiser had gone, whether the silent auction had raised much for the shop program, whether Priya's daughter had said anything nice about my class. I said it went fine. I said Priya's daughter apparently liked the birdhouse project. I did not say the word Sarah. I did not say the word Denver. I stood in my own kitchen, in the specific gold-orange light of the range hood over the stove, watching my wife of 7 years stack plates into a cabinet with the same easy, unhurried rhythm she always used, and I understood that I had a question sitting directly in front of me that I was choosing, in that exact moment, not to ask. Something tightened in my chest standing there, something I couldn't name yet but felt immediately, the specific, cold recognition that whatever came next in my life was going to be different from whatever had come before it, and that I hadn't asked for that, and that there was no way to hand it back. That night, lying next to her in bed, I listened to her breathing even out into sleep while I stayed awake staring at the ceiling fan doing its slow, useless rotation. I ran through every Thursday I could remember across the last 2 years, the green sweater she always wore for those dinners, the specific bottle of perfume from the left side of the bathroom counter, the 9:40 return time that had become as reliable as a scheduled train. I tried to remember if I'd ever once spoken to Sarah myself. A phone call. A text exchange. A photo from one of those 90 dinners. I couldn't come up with a single one. In 7 years of marriage, I had never once met, spoken to, or seen so much as a picture of the woman my wife had dinner with every week for the last 2 of them. I want to be honest about the kind of husband I'd been up to that point, because it matters for everything that comes after. I trusted Claire completely, not in the healthy, earned way people mean when they say that about a partner, but in the unexamined way you trust a floor you've walked across 10,000 times without once checking underneath it for rot. I never asked follow-up questions about her Thursday nights beyond the easy, surface-level ones. How was Sarah? What did you eat? Did you have fun? I never noticed, because I'd never once looked, that an entire relationship in my wife's life had apparently continued for 2 years without leaving a single trace I could verify. That's on me. I want to say that clearly, right at the start, because I'm not interested in telling this story as though I was a perfect man standing across from a woman who simply decided to destroy something flawless. I wasn't paying close enough attention to my own marriage to have noticed the shape of what was missing from it. That doesn't make what came next acceptable. It does mean I walked into that Tuesday night already carrying a blind spot wide enough to drive a lie through for 2 straight years without resistance. Thursday was 2 days away. I had no plan yet, no strategy, nothing beyond a cold hum sitting under my ribs and a woman's voicemail I hadn't yet thought to call. I lay there next to Claire that whole night, listening to the fan turn, running Priya's sentence over and over in my head, the Sarah who used to live on Bannock Street, moved to Denver 2 years ago, until it stopped sounding like new information and started sounding like something I should have already known. I had no idea, drifting finally into a thin, unsatisfying sleep somewhere around 1 in the morning, that I was about to spend the next 19 days learning exactly how far 2 years of Thursday nights could stretch a single lie, or that the answer to where those Thursdays had actually gone had been sitting, unremarked, in a gym bag by our own front door for the better part of a year. Wednesday morning, I woke up and, for about 4 minutes, managed to convince myself the whole thing had been a coincidence built out of nothing, a common name, a busy weekend, my own tired brain stitching 2 unrelated facts into a shape that wasn't really there. Then I got up, made coffee, packed Jack's lunch, and while Claire was in the shower I did the first thing in 7 years of marriage I'd never once done before. I opened her phone. It wasn't locked against me, we'd never had passcodes we didn't know for each other's phones, another one of those small, unexamined trusts I'd apparently been handing out for free. I scrolled to contacts, found Sarah M., and copied the number onto a sticky note before closing the phone and setting it back exactly where it had been, screen down, charger cord angled the same way. I called it from the school parking lot at lunch, sitting in my truck with a sandwich I didn't touch, heart going harder than it had any business going for something this small. It rang twice, and then a voicemail picked up, a young woman's voice, cheerful, a little breathless, the kind of greeting people record once and then forget about for years. "Hey, it's Sarah, I'm probably at class or buried in reading for my program out here. Leave a message and I'll call you back when I surface. Grad school. Out here. Not Boise. Not a Thursday dinner table 20 minutes from my house. I didn't think, sitting there in that parking lot, about how long a voicemail greeting like that usually sits unchanged before someone finally gets around to updating it. I should have wondered that from the very first ring. Instead I just sat there, sandwich going warm in its wrapper, listening to a stranger's recorded voice confirm something I already knew and still somehow hadn't let myself believe. I didn't call Claire about it. I didn't text her. I sat in that parking lot for what felt like a long time and was probably 4 minutes, and then I went back inside and taught 5th period how to set up a table saw fence, hands moving through a lesson I could have taught unconscious, mind somewhere completely different. That night, at dinner, Claire mentioned, easily, the way she mentioned everything now, that tomorrow was Thursday, and she'd be seeing Sarah. Jack, 5 years old and utterly without agenda, asked if Sarah could come to his birthday party this year, since he'd never actually met her. Claire laughed and said maybe, and changed the subject to whether Jack had finished his reading log, and I sat there watching my son ask, without any idea what he was doing, the exact question I hadn't been able to make myself ask out loud. I said nothing that night either. I told myself I needed to be sure before I said anything that could sound like an accusation. I told myself a version of that sentence more times over the following 2 weeks than I want to admit, and each time it bought me another day of not having the conversation I already knew I needed to have. Thursday came. Claire got ready the way she always did before a Sarah dinner, the green sweater from the back of the closet, the perfume from the specific bottle on the left side of the bathroom counter, out the door by 6:15 with her keys already in hand before I'd fully processed that this was happening in real time now, not in some hypothetical future conversation I kept rehearsing and abandoning. "Tell Sarah I say hi," I said, as casually as I could manage, standing in the doorway with Jack's hand in mine. "I will," she said, and didn't hesitate at all, didn't flinch, didn't glance away, didn't do any of the things a guilty person is supposed to do in the version of this story you'd expect. That unsettled me more than a flinch would have. A flinch, at least, would have been something to hold on to. I stayed home with Jack that night, made him mac and cheese from the blue box he loved, helped him build a Lego fire station on the living room floor while some kids' show played in the background, and the entire evening sat under a low, steady hum of dread I couldn't name and couldn't shake. I kept glancing at the clock on the microwave. 6:50. 7:30. 8:15. There's a specific kind of quiet that settles into a house when you're pretending everything is normal for the sake of a 5-year-old at your feet, snapping plastic bricks together and asking you which color goes on the roof. Maybe you've had a version of that evening yourself, hands moving through an ordinary night while your mind keeps circling back to a phone call that doesn't add up, a voicemail greeting recorded in another city, a woman's voice that had no business being the only real thing you'd learned all week. She came home at 9:40, same as always, keys jingling in the same rhythm, and said Sarah was doing well, said something vague about a new restaurant they'd tried downtown. I asked, keeping my voice as flat and unremarkable as I could manage, which restaurant. "That new Thai place on 8th, she said, a half beat too fast, I thought, though I couldn't be sure I wasn't just hearing what I already expected to hear, and moved past me toward the stairs before I could ask anything else, already talking about how tired she was, how she wanted to check on Jack before bed. I checked 3 days later whether a Thai restaurant even existed on 8th Street. There was one. New, maybe 3 months old, exactly the kind of specific, verifiable detail a person tells you either because they were genuinely there, or because they're improvising faster and better than you'd ever have given them credit for. I sat with that fact for a long time, turning it over, unable to decide which possibility scared me more. Over the next week, I started noticing things I apparently trained myself not to see for a very long time. The gym membership, for one. Claire had joined a place called Foothills Fitness 14 months earlier, a 24-hour gym across town, convenient to nothing in our actual daily route, and I had never once asked to see a receipt, a class schedule, anything beyond the sentence, "I'm going to the gym," which I had filed, without ever examining it, under things that were true by default. I logged into our shared bank account one evening after she'd gone to bed and pulled up 14 months of charges. Twice a week, sometimes 3, at hours that didn't always match when she'd told me she'd gone. A 6 a.m. charge on a morning she'd said she went at lunch. A Thursday charge, the same Thursday as the Thai place story, for an amount and a time that made no sense if she'd also been sitting in a restaurant downtown until 9:40. Jack, without any idea what he was handing me, mentioned one morning over cereal that Mommy's phone buzzes funny now, like a secret buzz, and when I asked what he meant, chewing slowly, working out how to explain something he'd noticed without the vocabulary to name it, he said she'd turned the sound off so it didn't ring anymore, just shook a little, and she always flipped it over fast whenever it buzzed at the dinner table. 5 years old, and he'd noticed a pattern it had taken me a full decade of marriage to even start questioning. I called my brother Colin that Saturday. Older than me by 3 years, blunt in the specific way our father had been blunt, the kind of man who'd never once sugar-coated anything for me across 36 years of being brothers. I asked him, straight out, sitting in my truck in his driveway because I couldn't make myself ask it inside where his wife might overhear, whether he'd seen Claire anywhere unusual lately. Anywhere that didn't make sense. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not long, maybe 3 seconds, but long enough that I understood, before he said a single word, that the pause itself was already an answer. I could hear him deciding something on the other end, weighing a version of loyalty I hadn't asked him to weigh, and whatever he said next was going to change the shape of everything I thought I understood about the last several months of my marriage. I saw her car outside the yard back in the spring, Colin said finally, his voice careful in a way I'd almost never heard from him. The bar off Fairview, past the credit union. It was a Thursday, actually, now that you're asking. I told myself it was probably some work thing, a coworker's birthday, whatever. I didn't want to be the guy who started something I couldn't finish, Ethan. I'm sorry. I should have called you. I sat in his driveway with the engine off, both hands still on the wheel like I was driving somewhere, and did the math without wanting to. Spring. That put it at least 5 months before this conversation, 5 months during which my brother had carried a piece of information he thought might matter and decided, each time he thought about telling me, that it probably didn't, or that it wasn't his place, or that he'd rather not be the one who cracked something open he couldn't help me put back together. If Colin had told me in the spring instead of now, I would have known 5 months earlier. I understood that clearly, sitting there with the truck ticking as it cooled, and it didn't feel like anger exactly, it felt more like watching a structure I already suspected was compromised finally show its first visible crack in daylight. I thanked him. I meant it, mostly. I drove home turning that name over in my head, the yard, a bar I'd driven past 100 times without ever once going inside, for minutes from Foothills Fitness, 6 minutes from the Thai place on 8th that may or may not have ever actually seen my wife walk through its door. She told me, much later, what those Thursday nights had actually become for her by that point in the story. This is what she was living through while I was still at home building Lego fire stations and telling myself there had to be some explanation. I remember sitting in the gym parking lot one particular Thursday, engine running, unable to make myself go inside and unable to make myself drive home either. I'd told Ethan I was meeting Sarah so many times by then that the lie didn't even feel like a decision anymore, it felt like a language I'd become fluent in without meaning to, one I could speak without thinking about the words. That night I actually had my hand on the gear shift, ready to turn around, go home, tell him everything before it went any further. And then my phone buzzed, his name, something small and ordinary, have you seen my grading folder, so completely unaware of what was happening 20 minutes away, and something in me just closed back up, the way a door swings shut on its own weight. I told myself, one more Thursday. I'd been telling myself that same sentence for almost a year. That's what she told me, all of it, much later. I knew none of it yet. All I had, driving home from Collins that Saturday, was a bar's name and my brother's voice still sitting in my ears, admitting he'd known something for 5 months and said nothing. The following Thursday, I did something I still can't fully defend, though I understand exactly why I did it. I followed her. I told myself it was reconnaissance, information gathering, nothing more, the same careful, methodical approach I'd used, checking a structure for a fault line before deciding whether it needed shoring up. I waited until she backed out of the driveway, gave her a 2-minute head start, and pulled out behind her with my headlights off until we hit the main road. She didn't go to the Thai place on 8th. She didn't go to Foothills Fitness. She drove straight to the yard, the bar Colin had named, and parked in a spot near the side entrance with the easy familiarity of someone who'd parked there many times before, who knew exactly which spot didn't get blocked in by the dinner crowd. I parked 2 blocks down, hands sweating against the wheel, feeling like a stranger inside my own life, watching through the windshield as a man I didn't recognize, dark jacket, maybe 40, moving with an easy confidence I immediately resented without being able to say exactly why, walked up to her at the door and hugged her the way you hug someone you've hugged 100 times before. Not a greeting hug. A returning hug. I didn't go in. I told myself I needed more than a parking lot and an embrace before I said anything I couldn't take back, that a hug, even a familiar one, wasn't proof of anything a lawyer or a reasonable person would call definitive. I drove home instead, sat in our driveway for 11 minutes with the engine off before I could make myself go inside, and when Jack asked why I looked tired, I told him Daddy just had a long day at school, which was, in its own way, the first outright lie I'd told in this whole story, and it came easier than I expected it to. Over the next several days, the small mysteries I'd been half noticing for weeks started assembling themselves into something with an actual shape. I noticed Claire had started keeping her phone face down on every surface, not just at the dinner table, the kitchen counter, the nightstand, the armrest of the couch, always screen side to the wood. I noticed she'd started taking slightly longer showers before her Thursday dinners, and slightly shorter ones the morning after. I noticed, one evening while she was upstairs, that a receipt had fallen out of her jacket pocket onto the mudroom floor, a coffee shop 3 blocks from the yard, time-stamped for a Tuesday, a day she had no dinner plans at all, no Sarah, nothing on the calendar that would explain why she'd been in that part of town. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever found yourself building a case against someone you love, piece by piece, receipt by receipt, you already know what that particular kind of loneliness feels like, the specific ache of being the only person in your own house who knows what you're looking for. I called the associations. No, there was no association here, this wasn't Charlotte, this was Boise, and the fabricated permission slip I was chasing wasn't a certification course, it was 2 years of Thursday night dinners with a woman who'd been 1,100 miles away for most of them. I did the version of that fact check anyway. I texted an old mutual friend from Claire's college years, someone who might still be in touch with the real Sarah, and asked, casually, whether she knew if Sarah still lived in Boise. The friend wrote back within the hour. Oh, Sarah moved to Denver like 2 years ago. For her master's. Haven't talked to her much since, tbh. Why? There it was, confirmed now by someone who had no reason to lie to me and no idea what she was confirming. 2 years. The exact length of the marriage inside my marriage that had apparently been running parallel to my own for longer than I wanted to calculate. I had a name now for the man I'd seen, not yet, but I had the shape of him, the jacket, the easy hug, the way he'd moved like someone who belonged exactly where he was standing. I had a bar, a coffee receipt 3 blocks away, a gym membership charged at hours that didn't match her stories, and a lie 2 years wide that I'd apparently walked past without noticing for every single one of those 90 Thursday nights. What I didn't have yet was proof solid enough to stand on when I finally said something out loud, and I had no idea that the piece that would finally make it undeniable was going to come, of all places, from my own son's mouth, 3 days before I was ready for it. 3 days after I followed her to the yard, I was loading the dishwasher after dinner when Jack wandered into the kitchen holding one of his dinosaur toys and asked, completely out of nowhere, the way 5-year-olds ask questions that split your life in half without meaning to, Daddy, why does Mommy call the man from the gym, baby, too? Isn't that what she calls you? I stood there with a plate in my hand, water still running, and asked him, as carefully and casually as I could manage with my heart suddenly slamming against my ribs, when he'd heard that. When she picked me up from Grandma's, he said, already losing interest, already moving his dinosaur along the edge of the counter. She was on the phone in the car. She said it was Mark from the gym. She said, "Okay baby, talk later," like she says to you sometimes. Mark. Not Sarah. A first name, finally, attached to the dark jacket and the easy hug outside the yard, and confirmed, however innocently, however unknowingly, by a 5-year-old repeating something he'd overheard without any concept of what it meant. I did not confront her that night. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to, immediately, standing right there in the kitchen with the water still running and my son's dinosaur clicking against the counter tile. But I'd learned enough about myself over the last 2 weeks to know that if I went to Claire with nothing but a 5-year-old secondhand phone call and a hunch, she could explain it away in 4 different directions before I even finished the sentence, and I'd be back to where I started, trusting a floor I'd never actually tested. So instead, I built a file. It felt strange, almost clinical, doing this to my own marriage, cross-referencing bank statements, gym charge timestamps, and the receipts I'd started quietly collecting from her jacket pockets and car console, laying it all out on my laptop like I was troubleshooting a structural fault rather than investigating my wife. But that was the only language I had for this kind of problem. You measure twice. You document everything. You don't accuse a beam of failing until you've actually traced the crack back to its source. I pulled 6 months of the joint account and found the pattern clearly for the first time, laid out in black and white instead of scattered across memory. Foothills fitness charges that clustered suspiciously around Tuesdays and Thursdays, sometimes twice in 1 week, at 6 in the morning and again at 7 at night, hours apart in a single day that no reasonable person needed to hit the same gym twice for. I found 3 more coffee shop charges near the yard, all on days she had no plans on our shared calendar. I found, going back through old text threads on my own phone, a pattern of her leaving her ringer off specifically on Thursday evenings, something I'd never once questioned, filed for years under, she just forgets. Looking back now, that gym membership was the loudest thing in the entire story, and I never once asked to see so much as a receipt for it. I told myself, for 14 months, that a woman going to the gym was the least suspicious thing in the world, and it was exactly that assumption, that specific kind of easy trust, that let 2 years of Thursday dinners hide inside a lie I never once thought to check. Wednesday night, I called the number listed for Foothills Fitness's front desk, invented a reason about updating our billing information, and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether they had a trainer or staff member named Mark. The woman on the phone, bored and unbothered, said, "Oh, sure, Mark's one of our personal trainers, he's usually in Tuesday, Thursday, and weekend mornings," and just like that, the last piece of vague uncertainty I'd been holding on to, that maybe this was all coincidence, maybe Mark was someone else's Mark, dissolved completely. A personal trainer. Same gym my wife had joined 14 months ago and never once asked me to join with her, despite years of me half-jokingly suggesting we try a couple's membership. Same gym she'd been charged at during hours that overlapped, impossibly, with dinners she claimed to be having with a woman who'd been living in Denver for 2 years. Thursday came again, the 3rd Thursday since the fundraiser, though it felt like I'd aged through several separate lifetimes in that span. I did not follow her this time. I stayed home, made Jack his usual mac and cheese, helped him with a puzzle instead of Legos, and spent the evening finishing the folder, printing statements, lining up dates in a column the way you'd line up load calculations on a beam you already suspected was going to fail. I called Colin again that night, after Jack was asleep, and told him what I'd found, the gym, the trainer, Mark, the receipts, Jack's secondhand phone call. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end before he said something I hadn't expected. "There's more, Ethan. I didn't tell you everything before. I saw them again, not just once, in the spring. I saw her car there again about 6 weeks ago. I should have called you that time too. I'm sorry, man. I really am." If Colin had told me the whole truth back at his driveway instead of rationing it out across 2 separate conversations, I might have confronted Claire 2 weeks earlier than I ultimately did. I understood, hanging up the phone that night, that even the people closest to me had been quietly deciding, piece by piece, how much of this truth I was allowed to have and when, protecting me, they'd have said, though it never once felt that way sitting alone in my kitchen at 11 at night with a folder full of dates spread across the table. I didn't think about how much of this had probably been visible to other people long before it was visible to me, not until that second conversation with Colin made it undeniable. I'd spent 2 years walking past a marriage that half my own family had apparently been quietly worried about, and nobody had said a word, because nobody wanted to be the one who cracked something open they couldn't help put back together. I understood something then that I hadn't let myself understand before. I hadn't been building a marriage those 2 years. I'd been maintaining the appearance of one, and telling myself that was the same thing. Friday morning, before school, I drove out to Foothills Fitness on my way to work, told myself I was just going to look, and sat in the parking lot for 9 minutes without going inside, watching people come and go through the glass doors in workout clothes, feeling like a stranger standing at the edge of my own life. I didn't go in. I didn't need to, not yet. I had what I needed: the file, the name, the pattern, my brother's 2 separate confirmations, my son's overheard phone call, and a folder of receipts thick enough now that it had its own weight in my hands when I finally closed it that night at the kitchen table. I decided, sitting there with the folder closed in front of me, that I wasn't going to wait for the following Thursday. 2 years of Thursdays had already been enough. I picked up my phone and texted Claire, who was upstairs putting Jack to bed, for words that felt heavier in my hand than anything I'd typed in 7 years of marriage: "We need to talk tonight." I didn't know yet, sending that text, that the conversation that followed wasn't going to give me the clean, satisfying confrontation I'd rehearsed in my head over 11 nights of imagining it. I didn't know that Claire, faced with 2 years of evidence laid out on our own kitchen table, was going to answer with 3 words so quiet and so absent of anything I'd braced myself for that they would end up hurting worse than any explanation I'd imagined. She came downstairs maybe 15 minutes after the text, Jack's door already closed behind her, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw the folder sitting closed on the table between us, and something in her face changed before either of us said a single word. Not shock, exactly. Recognition. The specific look of someone who has been waiting a long time for a door she knew was coming, finally hearing the knock. "What is this?" she said, though her voice already knew the answer better than mine did. "Open it," I said. She didn't move for a moment. Then she crossed the kitchen, sat down across from me, and opened the folder slowly, the way you'd open something you already expected to hurt. She looked at the bank statements. The gym charges circled in pen. The coffee receipt from 3 blocks off Fairview. The printed screenshot of the voicemail transcript I'd had to call twice to actually get down word for word. I'm probably at class or buried in reading for my program out here. She didn't cry. She didn't reach for an explanation. She sat very still, hands flat on either side of the folder, and after what felt like a full minute of silence stretching out between us in that kitchen, she said 3 words. Yes. It happened. That was it. No qualifier, no softening, no but it's not what you think. I had spent 11 nights rehearsing every version of this confrontation I could imagine, her crying, her denying, her turning it around on me the way I'd read people sometimes did, accusing me of invading her privacy, of not trusting her. I had not rehearsed this. I had not prepared for the particular devastation of a woman simply agreeing, flatly, that everything I'd assembled in that folder was true, without offering a single word to make it easier to hear. "How long?" I said, and my voice cracked on the second word in a way that embarrassed me even as it happened. "Almost 2 years," she said. Still flat. Still that same terrible stillness, like something in her had already left the room we were sitting in, weeks or months before this actual conversation. I felt something in my chest give way that I hadn't braced for properly, a physical sensation, palms going damp against my knees, my voice starting a sentence and then simply not coming back for several seconds. 2 years, I repeated, like saying it again might make it smaller. It didn't. Sarah moved to Denver 2 years ago and you used her. You used a woman who doesn't even live in this state anymore as your cover, every single week, for 2 years, and I never once. I couldn't finish it. I sat there with my hands gripping my own knees, breathing in a way that didn't feel entirely under my control, and I didn't try to stop what was happening in my chest, the way you're supposedly not allowed to as a grown man. I let it happen. It felt, in that moment, Less like weakness and more like something being physically pulled out of me that I had no say in. She watched me do that. She didn't reach across the table. She didn't apologize yet. She just watched, still and quiet, and something about her stillness against my collapse felt like its own kind of devastation, the absence of her reaching for me somehow louder than anything she could have said. "Tell me everything," I finally managed, once my breathing had leveled out enough to speak again. "All of it. From the start. I want to understand how 2 years happened without me noticing a single thing." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she started speaking, her voice had changed, not defensive anymore, not flat either, but something closer to relief, like she'd been carrying a version of this conversation in her body for so long that finally saying it out loud was its own kind of release. "It started small, and I know that's what everyone says, but it's true," she said. "Sarah moved to Denver, and it hit me harder than I let on. She'd been my person since college, the one I called when things were bad, and suddenly she was gone and I didn't tell you how much that actually gutted me, because it felt embarrassing to grieve a friendship like that out loud. I joined the gym that same month, honestly just to have somewhere to go, something that was mine. Mark was my trainer. At first it really was just that, an hour twice a week where someone asked how I was doing and actually waited for the real answer instead of the easy one. The first time I said Sarah's name instead of his, it wasn't even really a lie yet in my head. I told myself I was protecting something small and harmless, an hour where I felt like a person instead of just Jack's mom and your wife, running the house, managing the schedule at the hospital, managing everyone else's needs all day long. I told myself that hour didn't take anything away from you. That's the lie I told myself, Ethan, over and over, that it wasn't taking anything, so it wasn't really wrong. Then it became coffee sometimes, after. Then it became Thursdays instead of just gym sessions, dinner, actual dinner, sitting across from someone who looked at me the way you used to look at me before Jack, before the schedule ate every part of us that wasn't logistics. I kept telling myself, this is the last Thursday. I told myself that so many times I stopped believing it even as I said it. Every single Thursday I drove there telling myself it was the last one, and every single Thursday I stayed anyway. The fear was always there, underneath everything, fear of you finding out, obviously, but underneath that, a different fear I didn't understand until much later. My parents split up when I was 9, and I remember exactly the specific way my dad just stopped being in the house one day, no warning I understood at the time, just gone. I think some part of me has spent my whole life terrified that the people I love disappear without warning, and somewhere in my head, having Mark meant I had somewhere to go if that happened to us too. I know how twisted that sounds, building an exit before there was ever a fire. I know it doesn't make any of this okay. The shame is the part one still can't fully describe to you. I used to come home some Thursdays and stand in the kitchen doorway and not be able to look at Jack's drawings on the fridge, the ones he makes for Mommy and Daddy, because the woman looking at those drawings didn't feel like the same woman who'd been sitting across from Mark 20 minutes earlier. I started avoiding the hallway mirror on Thursday nights. I couldn't stand my own face in it. There was one night, back in September, when I almost told you everything. You asked if I was okay, out of nowhere, really asked, and for about 4 seconds I was going to say all of it, right there in this kitchen. And then Jack called out for water and you went upstairs, and I told myself that was a sign I wasn't supposed to say it yet. I know now it wasn't a sign of anything. It was just a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, sorry, needing water at exactly the wrong moment, and I used it as permission to keep going another month. She stopped there, and the kitchen went quiet in a way that felt different from every silence we'd had in that room before, not tense, not waiting for the next blow, just exhausted, both of us emptied out by what had finally been said out loud after 2 years of it living unspoken between us. "So what now?" she said finally, and there was no bargaining in it, no plea. Just the same flat exhaustion she'd opened the whole conversation with. "I don't know yet," I said, and that was the truest thing either of us had said all night. "But I know I'm not the man who's going to sit here and pretend I can just absorb 2 years and a Denver zip code and a 5-year-old repeating the word baby back to me like it's nothing. I don't know if I can forgive this. I want to. I don't know if wanting to is enough. She nodded, slowly, like she'd already expected that answer, like some part of her had known, driving home from the yard for the last time 3 weeks ago, that this was always where it was going to end. I went upstairs alone that night, and she stayed at the kitchen table, and I didn't know yet, climbing those stairs with my legs feeling strange and unfamiliar under me, that the next 6 weeks were going to be the hardest test of a decision I'd already half made without letting myself admit it, whether wanting to forgive someone was ever actually the same thing as being able to. I want to be honest about the 6 weeks that followed, because if I only tell you about the ending, it won't mean anything. I tried. That's the part people who haven't lived through this sometimes skip past when they hear a story like mine end in divorce. They assume the answer was obvious the moment the truth came out, that anger simply took over and marched me toward the door. It didn't happen that way. I loved her. I still loved the version of her sitting across from me at that kitchen table, and for 6 weeks I genuinely tried to build something out of what was left. We went to a counselor, a woman named Diane with an office off State Street and a box of tissues that seemed strategically placed for exactly this kind of conversation. Claire came to every session. She answered every question honestly, as far as I could tell, more honestly, in some ways, than she'd been able to be in our own kitchen, because Diane knew how to ask the questions in an order that didn't let either of us hide behind the last 2 years' worth of practiced silence. I understood something in Diane's office in week 3 that I hadn't let myself understand before, that denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you're ready to pay. I'd been choosing it for years, long before Mark ever existed, long before Sarah ever moved to Denver. I'd chosen not to ask about the gym membership. I'd chosen not to notice the phone turned face down. Claire had been living the actual cost of a marriage where nobody asked real questions, and I'd been living in the comfortable version where nobody had to. That understanding didn't fix anything, though. That's the part one wasn't prepared for. Insight doesn't undo 2 years. I'd sit across from her at dinner, watching her pass Jack the ketchup, and some nights I'd feel almost normal, almost like we might actually come back from this. Other nights, I'd watch her check her phone at the table, completely innocuous, probably a text from her sister, and something in my chest would seize up so hard I'd have to leave the room, and I'd stand in the garage with my hands on the workbench until it passed. I told her, in week 5, sitting in Diane's office with my hands pressed flat against my knees the way I'd learned to keep them still, that I didn't think I could get past it. Not because I didn't believe she was sorry. I did believe that, by then, the version of remorse she'd shown me in the weeks since that kitchen table conversation was real, not performed. But I understood, finally, that the problem wasn't only whether I believed her sorrow. It was that I could no longer sit across from her at dinner without doing math in my head, how many Thursdays, how many mornings she'd gone to the gym and come home smelling like someone else's version of normal, how many times Jack had said the word Sarah to me across a kitchen table while his mother let him believe it. I don't think I can build anything new on top of that, I told her. I think every good day we have from here on out is going to have 2 years sitting underneath it, and I don't know how to live on top of a foundation like that. She didn't argue. That was, in its own way, the last piece of honesty she gave me. She didn't beg, didn't promise a version of the future that erased the past, didn't try to convince me my instinct was wrong. She just nodded, the same slow nod from that first night, and said she understood, and that she was sorry in a way she knew didn't fix anything, and that she'd spend a long time learning to live with what she'd cost both of us. I filed for divorce 2 weeks after that final counseling session. Mark, as it turned out, was already gone from the picture by the time any of this reached its conclusion, not because of some dramatic confrontation, but in the quieter, more common way these things sometimes end. Claire told me, in one of our last honest conversations before the paperwork made most conversations unnecessary, that once he understood the affair was actually going to be discovered, once the private, contained version of it was at risk of becoming public and complicated, he'd stopped returning her calls within the month. No scene, no goodbye. He'd simply stopped being available, the excitement and the secrecy having apparently been most of what he'd wanted from it in the first place. She never heard from him again after that. Colin, for his part, spent a long time apologizing to me for the 5 months of silence, and I spent an equally long time deciding how much of that apology I was willing to accept. I told him, eventually, exactly how frustrated I'd been, that I understood why he'd hesitated, but that his hesitation had cost me time I couldn't get back, months where I could have made different decisions with different information. It cost something to say that to him directly instead of just letting it go the easy way. It cost less than swallowing it would have. Jack, 5 years old and still mostly unaware of the actual shape of what had happened, asked me one evening, a few months after Claire had moved into her own apartment, why Mommy didn't live with us anymore. I told him the smallest true version a 5-year-old could hold, that Mommy and Daddy had stopped being able to make each other happy, and that none of it was anything he had done. He thought about that for a while, still holding his dinosaur, and said, "I still miss her drawings on the fridge though," which wasn't quite what I'd expected him to say, and which undid me a little more than I let him see. I got the house in the settlement, not through any dramatic legal maneuvering, just the straightforward math of who'd need the stability for a 5-year-old's routine, and the undisputed paper trail of gym charges and receipts that made the timeline of the affair impossible to argue against. Claire kept her job at the hospital. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment across town, close enough that Jack's schedule didn't have to change much, far enough that I stopped, eventually, driving past streets that used to mean something specific to me. I started sleeping through the night again sometime around the following spring, the first real stretch of it in longer than I could remember. I hadn't announced that to anyone, hadn't marked the date. I just noticed, standing at the kitchen counter one ordinary Tuesday morning making Jack's lunch, that the specific tightness I'd carried in my chest for months, the kind I'd stopped consciously noticing because it simply never left, wasn't there anymore. I stood there for a second just to be sure, the same way you double-check a measurement even after the tape's already told you the answer. I could have stayed angry. For a long stretch of that year, I was, a low, steady kind of anger that showed up in how hard I closed cabinet doors, in how short my patience ran with things that had nothing to do with any of it. I chose, eventually, not to stay there. That was the only kind of winning that ended up actually mattering to me. I'm not the same man who stood in that gymnasium holding a warm cup of punch, 11 seconds away from understanding his whole life was about to change. I ask more questions now, not suspicious ones, just real ones, the kind that wait for an actual answer instead of accepting the easy version. I joined Jack's Cub Scout troop that fall, something Claire had always managed before, and found I was better at showing up fully for the small, unglamorous parts of parenting than I'd given myself credit for. I still teach shop. I still trust the wood in front of me to tell me the truth about itself. I've just stopped extending that same unexamined trust to everything else in my life without occasionally checking underneath it. If you've ever found out the floor under your life wasn't what you thought it was, you already know there's no clean version of what comes after. There's just the part where you start rebuilding, more carefully this time, and you notice, eventually, standing in an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary morning, that you're standing a little steadier than you used to.